Facepalm America, I'm Beowulf Rockland. FacepalmAmerica.com is where you can find, as usual, more information about the show, interact with us on social media, listen to past episodes, that sort of thing. And if ever you want to call us, and some people do, and I'll after the interview that we're going to do, I'll bring up a couple of comments that you guys have had from recent episodes. You can do that at 202-656-6271. You can message us, or you can call us. Leave a message. We'll get back to you. We'll arrange a time for you to be on the air. We like to interact with folks who listen to the program, and we like to keep up the old tradition of talk radio. So don't be afraid. We would love to have you on the show. We'll do it in a way that's comfortable for you. 202-656-6271. I have been trying, for a long time, to make sense of current politics, the way that government operates in the United States of America and in the West. And I've found very few sources of information, very few political models and ideologies that work, that seem to comprehensively grasp at what's going on. And I look to history a lot whenever I get a chance. And I thought it would be interesting to go back as far as ancient and classical philosophy goes. And there has been a book written by the person we're speaking with today, Melissa Lane, called Of Rule and Office, Plato's Ideas of the Political. I thought this would be a good thing to investigate. How did folks in antiquity see politics? Is there something that we can learn from that about how we should construct and organize our government and our politics today? Melissa Lane, welcome to Facepalm America. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Beowulf. I'm delighted to be here.
So if you could tell us a little something, just a very broad overview. I never studied philosophy, at least not the philosophy of antiquity of the Greeks and the Romans, not of that era, and so I don't know much about Plato in general. A few tidbits here and there, but really not much, particularly concerning his view of government, of the way that society should be organized. I know that a lot of Greek philosophy certainly informs the way the U.S. government was constructed, and that Greek and Roman philosophers were very much in the minds of the founding fathers. But what was government like for Plato? Like when he conceived of government, like what was that for him? Let's just kind of start with that basic context, if we could.
Right. So Plato lives from the 5th into the 4th century, before the Christian or the Common Era. So, and he is born an Athenian citizen at a time when Athens was already the leading democracy in the ancient Greek world. So Athens is one of about 1,000 different Greek city-states at the time, but it's the biggest in terms of population, and it's the most one of the most significant. And so it's important that Plato is living in a democracy, although it then suffers 2 brief periods of kind of oligarchic revolution when he's a young man. And around that same time, he's befriended the philosopher Socrates, who is then put to death by the restored democracy in 399 after a trial. He's convicted and put to death. And Plato, we think, starts to write in the wake of that experience. So there's a lot already on his political plate. There's democracy, there's oligarchic revolutions and coups, which have then been overturned and the democracy has been restored. And there's this kind of conflict between what many people have come to think of as democracy and free speech, or democracy and philosophy, in the person of Socrates. But I also like to say that I think we should see all of this in a broader context, which is that most of the ancient Greek regimes at this time, whether they were democracies or they were oligarchies, that was the main choice of government at this time. And it was really a question of to what extent were the poorest free male citizens enfranchised or not?
Right.
So this is a time in which in all Greek city-states, there are slaves, so
Right.
there are people who are enslaved, so we have
Right.
to acknowledge that up front. And women have a kind of anomalous status where they're citizens, but they are in these city states in general, but they lack certain political privileges. So
Right.
in Athens, for example, the women, you can describe a woman as an Athenian citizen, and she's a free woman, but she doesn't have the right to vote, to participate in the assembly, to hold office. But what I wanted to say, just to conclude this kind of very general answer, is that um, uh, in the democracies as well as in the oligarchies, there is what I think of as constitutional government in this period, which
Mm.
means that there are office holders who are chosen either through election or lottery. They have defined terms of office, they have limited powers, and there are end of term accountability audits that are applied to them,
Mm.
where they have to give an account of how they have used public money, and in Athens also more generally how they've used their public powers. So I find that one of the most interesting parts of ancient Greek government. And I think, and one of the things I argue in this book is that I think Plato does too, although he wanted to improve on it, arguably, in ways that we can explore.
That's interesting. The concept of an exit interview that holds accountability for someone that was in office. That certainly you could see how that would have an impact if it were implemented currently. It might, dissuade people, for example, from just hopping from public office to go into industry and then using their connections to facilitate, the lobbying for particular corporations. It seems to happen so often. And just to go back and clarify a little bit, it sounds in some ways not too dissimilar from how the United States started, in the sense that there was slavery, and women were not allowed to vote. But am I understanding correctly that even if you were poor and did not hold property, you as a male in ancient Athens could vote? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And that was the major democratic innovation in Athens. And it comes about gradually, so there's a range of different changes and developments. But one thing that's actually interesting to say is it's not only a question of voting in the assembly. It was also a question of being a juror in the law courts, which held
Okay.
sway over most law cases. Not all. There were separate courts for homicide, but for most law cases, there were no professional judges. So ultimately, it was a jury that could be composed of the poorest Athenians, or a kind of a randomly chosen group of Athenians. But then you would be chosen randomly to be on the juror rolls. But then it was up to you to decide whether you went to court on any given day and actually kind of participated in a trial. So that was actually seen as one of the major levers of democratic power, was the power of the juror, and not only the power to vote in the assembly. And then there's a question about whether the poorest people could also hold these offices, which were these typically 1 year offices that ended with the accountability audit that we mentioned. As far as we can tell, probably many or most of those offices might have ultimately been opened up to the poorest. Historians infer that. Our evidence isn't 100% clear about that, but certainly people could go to the assembly, they could choose the people in office for those who were elected, and they could serve as jurors. And those things were really important forms of democratic power.
Well, jury duty is very much on my mind these days because I have it coming up in a few weeks myself, and it's
Well, yeah, and that's a great example of, often people think, oh, ancient Athenian democracy was so different from our own, and it was different in some important ways. They made much more use of lottery. There was this sense that, these offices rotated more broadly, but they had juries as we do. They had the poorest people in males, in society being enfranchised as we do. They had, terms of office as we do. So, I think in those ways, there's actually more in common than we sometimes think.
And in terms of the property requirement, which at the beginning of the United States, most states had a property requirement for being able to vote, and so in that sense, it seems like it was freer than we were, at least at the start of our nation.
Yeah, I mean, actually, that's an interesting point. It actually parallels in the sense that the great Athenian lawgiver of the 6th century BC, Solon, actually sets up 4 property classes, and he officially reserves the offices for the top 3 property classes.
Okay.
But he sets up these popular law courts and gives the people power, and also to serve then as the auditors who are then ultimately going to, judge the officers. So then there's this kind of interesting thing where you may not have the power to be in the office, but if you get to sit in judgment on them, that's almost better in a certain way. And then there's a similar kind of, gradual increasing of the powers of the poorest. So I think you're parallel to the United States, where there's a kind of gradual, with the Jacksonian era and so on,
Right.
kind of meaningful enfranchisement of the poorest citizens is again, poorest male citizens is again, a good comparison.
It's interesting to me to think about what Plato thought about this. What were his observations about government? What sort of government did he advocate, and how did he react to what was happening in his time, especially in the context of, as you mentioned, a government that had enacted capital punishment on someone who was, his role model, Socrates. What was his response to this? What did he think were the flaws and the benefits of a governmental system like that, and what did he envision as an ideal?
Great. So there's a lot of questions there that I think will give us a lot to talk about over the next few minutes.
Sure.
So let me maybe start with Socrates, because I think it's helpful to go back to that. And Socrates is a real historical figure. A lot of what we know about him comes from Plato, but we also have other contemporaries who wrote about him, such as Xenophon, for example. So we're kind of triangulating to figure out about the life of Socrates. And one of the things that Plato certainly presents Socrates as doing is challenging what he takes to be this democratic idea that there's no special political expertise. Because the thought is, if there's special political expertise, then we shouldn't be choosing people by lottery or maybe even by election, because we might get it wrong. We should sort of, just as we would, Socrates gives these examples in Plato's writings, just as we would call in a carpenter to advise us on carpentry,
Right.
So we should find the true political expert and we should get them to
Right.
be in charge, or at least to advise, rather than. So this question of knowledge and ignorance, is the democracy kind of assuming that there's no specialized expert knowledge that is relevant to politics? That's kind of one of the main tropes that you can see Plato kind of picking up. But my own work, and there are different ways, well, maybe before I go on to the next bit, there are different ways to respond to that. So the historian Josiah Ober, for example, wrote a book called Democracy and Knowledge, where he made a kind of Tocquevillian argument in response to Socrates and Plato's critique, saying, actually, by participating in these different civic institutions that we discussed, the Athenian Democrats were kind of educated through participating, like the
Right.
New England
Right.
town meeting or
Right.
something like that, right? So he wanted to say, really, it's a question of, what do you mean by knowledge? But Plato and Socrates did have this very kind of, they were very interested in these forms of craft or professional knowledge, medicine, navigation, that architecture that had emerged. And their thought was, surely we should not just leave politics to amateurs. We should sort of try to see if we could figure out what kind of knowledge would genuinely be relevant to politics. So that's kind of step one,
Okay.
but there's a few
Interesting.
other steps. But let me just pause there
Sure.
for a minute.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. You can see that continue to play out in the various advocates that we've had of of a sort of technocracy and like the idea that you have an election. Well, this person doesn't have any experience, and they shouldn't be trusted in